This is Ajam DK from the U.S. Human Rights Network, and as I was saying, we're delighted to have everyone on the call. I will ask again, if you are on the call, please mute your phone or your computer so that you do not create background noise for the rest of us. The U.S. Human Rights Network is a national network of over 250 organizations and thousands of individuals who have really come together to help build a human rights movement and culture in the United States, and one that is led by people who are most directly impacted by human rights violations. And we really are focused on a people-centered human rights movement. So part of what we help facilitate with the help of our members, partners, allies, is to really prepare people and help equip people with information to take full advantage of international human rights treaty reviews. We have a critical agenda today. For today's webinar, we're extremely honored and grateful to Joteka Edie of the NAACP and to Leonard Gorman of the Navajo Nation for making the time to join us and to share with us today. They both have incredibly busy schedules and have carved out some time to prepare and to share important information so that we can be as prepared as we can be for the week in Geneva, as well as for those people going to Geneva, as well as for people at home. But the focus today is really to give us a sense of what we can expect in Geneva. So I will briefly do an overview of the agenda, and then we can go into the main portion of the webinar. So, as I mentioned, this is really an opportunity for you to hear from people who've been doing this for a long time on what to expect at the United Nations. We're grateful again to have Joteka Edie go over that portion with us. And then right after that, we will have a presentation by Leonard Gorman, who is with the Navajo Nation's Human Rights Commission. And he will also go over a critical piece of this work, which is the relationship that Indigenous peoples have with the land that we now call the United States, as well as with the CERD Committee, and some of the struggles that they've had and some of the primary demands they're making of the United Nations to recognize tribal governments as governments, and not to somehow try to lump tribal nations and tribal governments in with civil society, because that's different. So we'll be hearing from Leonard, and that will prepare us also for Geneva. Then Salima Hankins, our intrepid coordinator, CERD coordinator, will be giving us an overview of what's next, again in preparation for the review itself. And then we will do the Q&A at the end. We are reserving questions for the end of the webinar. So I guess before we turn over, I just wanted to say a few things, which is that we are in the home stretch. We're in the home stretch for this final phase of the work. I mean, not final, oh my God, the first phase of the work. And that is the pre-review phase. And it's very critical at this point to stay focused on what we're trying to achieve. And that's using the CERD review most effectively to achieve racial justice as a human right in the United States. And our work together is really a critical aspect for our collective movement building to advance human rights for all, which is what we're all engaged in doing. We do have a lot of work, and I know several of you have been incredibly busy trying to pull things together for the review as well as all the other things on your plate. So we have a lot of work to do and very limited time, and most of us very stretched capacity and resources. So I really want to thank you all for all the work that you've done and to encourage you to keep up the momentum. We need it. We need your energy, enthusiasm. And in particular, I would like to thank you all for the collaborative spirit that people have shared so far. We've seen it, for example, in our speakers today, who have really carved out time to join us from very incredibly busy schedules. We've seen it from our CERD task force members. We've seen it from our working groups on the different issues, from members, from allies. And I think we all know that collaboration is a key to our success. So this is just a reminder and an encouragement to stay on the course. It will mean giving some and taking some. And that give and take means that we all win in the end. So that's the first thing I would say. Then the second related to that is on communication. And we all know that in doing the movement work, it's important to constantly share information with each other, to share intelligence with each other, and to share strategy with each other. It's also important to share and receive information in a respectful manner. So as we move forward, we really need to remember and to remind ourselves, even under the most stressful and stretched situations, to share the information that we do share respectfully and to be mindful of the different communication styles and cultures that we all have. And then finally, of course, is let's keep our eyes on the prize. So with that, I am really grateful and honored to turn over to Joteka Edie, who is a very experienced at the United Nations and in human rights and in doing racial justice work. Joteka is with an NAACP and has just completed a very busy annual conference. And so we're so delighted that she could join us today and to talk about effective participation in the United Nations. So with that, I'll turn over to you, Joteka.
Great. Thank you so much, and good evening to everyone. I apologize in advance for not being able to time call. And I did wanted to note that this is a presentation that has been adapted from a previous presentation that I co-authored with Dr. Deborah Robertson, who was formerly with International Possibilities Unlimited. So just an overview of this PowerPoint. We're going to actually go over four areas: introduction, an overview, your first day, what happens there, and advocacy while in the UN. Dr. Deborah Robertson, who I mentioned, the former Executive Director of International Possibilities Unlimited, she spent a lot of time doing a lot of work in the UN, previously in the Human Rights Commission, now Council, and it just really has a long career. I just wanted to note that she was really inspirational. Of course, I'm Joteka Edie. I'm the Senior Advisor to the President and CEO of the NAACP. Previously, I spent time the Program Director at the National Coalition About Death Only. We did a lot around the World Conference Against Racism and a lot of work in the Human Rights Council, lifting up the death penalty as a violation of human rights. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but just an overview of just the UN in general. Of course, we all know that the Commission on Human Rights was created in 1946. It first met in 1947. The NAACP has had a long history of advocacy before the UN. In 1947, we submitted what was called an appeal to the world. I think going into this CERD review, when you look at the appeal to the world, it's very much like a shadow report that was submitted on the situation of African Americans in the United States during that time. Sadly, if you look at the appeal to the world, I encourage all of you, if you haven't read it, to read it while much has changed, much still in education, the over incarceration and of African Americans living in the U.S., not only in the South but also in the North, issues around housing discrimination, disparities as it relates to health, and the fact that there was a denial of the access to the ballot box for African Americans back when this appeal was submitted in 1947, it still rings true today. And so it's a document that I think it foreshadows. I think it's the shadow report of shadow reports. And I would encourage you all to read that, to find it online, or you can go to the NAACP's website. So CERD, we all know what CERD is. We're all going to be there. So we know that it's one of 3 human rights treaties that the United States has signed and ratified. We know that it is very important and that there's a review that takes place generally every 5 to 7 years, and we're upcoming our review. Just location of where is within the UN system. Of course, the UN, is a very large organization. A lot of moving parts. And so CERD falls under the General Assembly in the section around that deals directly with human rights. It's a thematic commission. It's thematic in the sense that it's a treaty body mechanism in that CERD actually works to implement the actual treaty bodies. And which is the CERD committee focuses on nations of state parties to the actual CERD treaty. So I'm going to go and skip over, and we're going to talk about your first day. So the first thing that you need to do, and we're going to be in 2 buildings. We're going to be at Palais Wilson. We're going to hear Palais Nation. So Palais Wilson is this building here. And so the first thing you have to do when you get there is pick up your credentials. And generally for proceedings that take place at Palais Wilson, you have to pick up your credentials at the guard's door, which is in this entrance at this building at Palais Wilson. And I apologize in advance. I meant to put in a slide that actually shows you the bus system in Geneva. But one thing that you should know, when you get to Geneva, every hotel will give you a pass to ride the bus system and or the tram system. You just need to pass with you at all times, and you can ride the bus for free. There's no paying to get on the bus or get off the bus, and it's a complete honor system. They may ask you for your pass. They may not ask you, but it's a short bus ride or a walk to get to Palais Wilson for most of the hotels near and around the United Nations. Once you get your badge, you should know that once you're in the UN system, there are a lot of badges. And it's always important to know what the different badge colors mean. There's one badge, if you can see on the photo here, there's a gentleman with a brown badge. That badge is generally a UN NGO badge. A red badge generally denotes a government representative badge. A blue badge is generally a government permanent observer badge. And then a yellow badge generally denotes the top of the mission. So it's generally an ambassador or permanent resident. You also see these blue badges, and some NGOs or permanent representatives will have these blue badges. So it's just always helpful to know, who you're talking to. It's just a great way to kind of have an understanding of if you're talking to another NGO, if you're talking to a member of government, if you're talking to a member of committee. So when we go into the UN, there are 2 buildings. There's the Palais Nation, and there's the Palais Wilson. So the Palais Nation is the main UN building. When we enter, there's a beautiful entrance with all these wonderful flags. We don't enter there. We actually enter around the corner. And we enter in Palais Wilson at this entrance, which is the entrance closest to door 40. And once you get in there, you kind of walk up, and then you make a left, and you'll see a sign that says door 40. And then you see the newer part of the UN building that was recently built in the late 70s, early 80s. And that is where we enter into the building, into the Palais Nation building. Once you're in the building, there's a place where you can pick up documents for the orders of the day, and that's generally off to your left. You can pick up documents there. There's some information in this PowerPoint about UN document numbering. I won't bore you with that, but you can take a look at that later. One of the most important places in the Pali Nation, which is where the actual review will take place, is the Serpentine Lounge. That is where all the work happens in the UN. That's where a lot of the negotiations happen. That's where a lot of meetings happen, in the Serpentine Bar and Lounge. You can get lunch there. You can get coffee there. You can get snacks there. But it is a really place where most people will meet. There's meeting in the Serpentine Lounge. That is where they're talking about this place, and it looks like this. And there's another picture of the Serpentine Lounge. You can see there are a lot of people in there, and it's often a lot of meetings. There's also an NGO lounge that is in the UN. People don't use it as often, but it is located adjacent to the cafeteria in the UN. And then, of course, there's also ability to buy materials, whether it's stapler copies, paper, whatever you need. There is a store located on the main level of Pali Nation, and it's still in existence, and you can buy some things there. The UN cafeteria is located, and there's a map. It's in the Pali Nation, and there's also a cafeteria in Pali Wilson, which is the UN cafeteria is self-explanatory, but you can also have meetings as well, and there's just another picture of the cafeteria. So what happens at CERD? So there's a timetable, there's an agenda, there's orders of the day, there are oral statements, there's interactions, dialogues, and there's key observations. And then when we talk about sort of the advocacy that we do there, there's a lot of that we can do. One, there's direct folks actually meeting with members. This was doing ICCPR. There's a member of the ICCPR issues that. Number two, you can also use that time to meet with special mechanisms, and these are special rapporteurs. Another interested in meeting with special rapporteurs. There's a picture of me long time ago, I think in 2003 or 2004, meeting with the UN Special Rapporteur on executions. And of course, you can see this meeting is happening in the Serpentine Lounge. There's also the ability to put forth oral interventions. Of course, time is very, very limited, and we actually have to be very strategic sharing time with advocates, because it's very important that all the issues are lifted up and we don't dominate on one issue. And the committee members really want to hear a broad base, really based on the issues that they're going to focus on. And so there's a sort of a photo of what it looks like where you're giving your oral intervention. And you see she has an orange badge on. Another activity happen is briefings. Some of them happen at lunchtime, and some of them happen other times, and they're informal. There's a picture of a lunchtime briefing, two pictures. One was just recently doing the ICCPR. One is in the Pali Nation, the one on the left, and the one on the right is in the Pali Wilson building. And again, you're going to hear Pali Wilson, and you're going to hear Pali Nation. Pali Wilson is an older UN building where most of these thematic sessions take place. Pali Nation is the building where UN Human Rights Council meet and a lot of the bigger meetings. Because of the size of our review, they're going to move our actual review to Pali Nation. So you're going to hear Nation and Wilson, Nation and Wilson. So I'm going to go back and forth in this, but I just really want to reiterate that they're two different buildings. Another important aspect of being in Geneva is just networking with other NGOs and national organizations. And there's a meeting of just a group of young people that were meeting and really sharing work, information about Wicked racism, and there were representatives here from actually every of various places where the African diaspora in meeting, and of course those are opportunities that we want to seize while we're in Geneva. The other very important aspect with really specific recommendations on language. We cannot stress enough that members of the committee really want specificity. Like, it's good to say, this is what I think about this work about voting rights, and this is what I think about racial profiling and this, but very specific language. We think that you have this question. We believe that you should make this recommendation, some very specific statistics that answers your specific question, and not giving them 2 pages. They really would appreciate a paragraph or 5 pages. So that is very important. So that's why in this photo, this is a long time ago, the photo with a representative. And if you notice, there's a piece of paper because that on that piece of paper was a very specific recommendation on language. So preparations for CERD. I think there are a couple of things that we all should know going into Geneva. One, we got to track the issue.
Right. Good. I'll also need a Pakistan. This is the smallest student. Perfect.
Sources of information.
Hi, Joteka.
Yes?
Oh, sorry, this is Ajam. I don't know, I'm sorry to interrupt. There is a lot of background noise, and I'm not sure if it's coming from you, but if there is background noise, we understand you're on the road. Maybe just to repeat a few things so that we make sure people hear all the information, because it's also important.
I apologize. I'm actually white, so I think it's someone else who has phone on mute.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Thank you, though. I'll see who else we can send a note to. Go ahead.
Okay. So their preparations for CERD. So we need to utilize all mechanisms.
Actually, can I get 20 bucks?
I thought it stopped, but it's still going. We want to make sure we're in contact with committee members and UN officials in advance to schedule meetings. Of course, we want to put forth our shadow reports, which we've all done here.
Either way.
For intervention. And
I like your... did you make it?
No, we will sell a note.
Hello?
Me too.
Maybe some more green chocolate that they on sale right now.
I'm so sorry, everyone. I think someone doesn't have their phone is not on mute. Okay, so and the final piece is that you want to always bring packets of information, and so it's just a folder and maybe your written intervention, your shadow report, some background and statistics about as it relates to the issue that you're covering, and then contact information on how you can be reached. Tracking your issue. So one, you got to determine what your issue number is, or what article it is. For instance, it's Article 6 or Article 25. Read the final report from the previous CERD session. That's absolutely important. Read what was said last time. Read what recommendations were made last time. And also read all the documents or any special mandates or discussions that may be happening around the issue. For example, voting rights that may be happening, because you may want to lift up some of those issues so that your recommendations are isolated. So what happened in ICCPR, what might have happened in the Human Rights Council, or what the Special Rapporteur that covers that issue may have said, so that you're knowledgeable of all of the conversations that are happening in the UN on this issue. And then you can find a lot of that on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights website. And then also, I can't stress enough, it's important to read all the documents distributed during the current session. And then, of course, these are some of the websites where you can get that information. Again, I want to stress it's important to use all mechanisms and all bodies. Of course, there are thematic and country mechanisms, and then there are a number of working groups. You can get further information. It's not as germane to the U.S. because there hasn't been country visits on some issues recently. I know there was a country visit on toxic dumping, so maybe there's some things that came out of that could be utilized. Advocacy with UN officials. It's important to research key staff and mandates to cover your issue. Read their reports. reports and bios prior to your meetings. You'll note that many of them are academics and scholars, and so they might have spent time in the U.S. And they probably, and one thing you should know, they do read the newspaper a lot, and so they will ask you questions about current events. Reach out in advance when possible. Share information about your issue, about how you can further the work, and then follow up with the email and continue building the relationship. I've had a really incredible experience of building relationships with many staff in the UN, and it's been over 10 years now, but many of them are still there, and they become very helpful in helping you really advance and move your issue, because they, like you, are advocates of human rights organizers as well. Either they work for NGOs prior to coming to the UN, or they view themselves as organizers and human rights activists, but they're just working within the UN. So they have an interest of not necessarily being a barrier, but being a conduit for you to advocate and advance the work. Advocacy with the members, much like it is with the UN officials, you want to study, it says HRC, it should say CERD. You want to study the composition of the CERD committee and the issues important to those members to determine your allies. So which member on the committee really cares about racial profiling? Which member on the committee really pressed on questions as it relates to voting rights? And figure out who that member is so that you can really focus on that member. Next, you want to determine who is leading the key issues, because often the committee, they will divide up who's really covering which issue, because there's so few of them and so many issues, they're not going to stumble over each other. So there may be one or two who are really focused on voting rights, and so that's who you want to talk to. Or the person that's focused on housing discrimination or gender discrimination or education inequality, you want to focus on that person. So while you want to talk to everyone, you really want to focus on talking to the one who's leading on your issue. And then you can reach out in advance when possible. Many of them have websites. The UN Blue Book isn't as germane for these committee members, but it also provides contact information for a lot of folks within the UN system. During this session, you should attend informal meetings. I know that the U.S. Human Rights Network is organizing some informal briefings. And then you want to provide these members with information. You want to give them a packet. Ideally, you can schedule a brief lunch or coffee with them in the Serpentine Lounge or at the Tally Wilton for breakfast. And then, of course, always follow up with the email to build the relationship. I'm not going to go much into this, but because this is past, but submitting shadow reports is really important. It allows you to provide more information. Your document becomes official. It's best submitted if it's done by June, which we know a lot of us were working on that. And you want to put your written, it's a difference between written and oral. So your written shadow report allows you to be more substantive. Your oral, you have probably a minute to hit the highlights, and then you can always refer to your written report. And then, of course, all the shadow reports can be found on the UN website. And so this is just sort of what kind of written intervention looks like before the UN, and so you can see that they become official documents. It's always important to have a press strategy. I can't stress enough, for your delegation, you want to put out but prior to going to Geneva, you want to put out a press release, you want to do some interviews, you want to do some blogging. While you're in Geneva, you want to try to get press if you're having parallel events. You want to do interviews with foreign press and domestic press, video blogging, you want to do videotaping. Post Geneva, you want to do a press release, maybe a press conference call, media interviews. And you also want to ensure that you are lifting up what actually happens as it relates to concluding observations. And then while you're in Geneva, you want to actually maybe do a parallel event. I know that the U.S. Human Rights Network and the NAACP and a number of our partners are going to be doing one. Here's an example of a flyer for a parallel event from a previous event. But you also want to make sure you put out flyers for your event so that as many people as possible can attend. One other thing that has been extremely helpful in advocacy before going to Geneva for myself and the NAACP and even my previous work there doing anti-death penalty work was having packets, just a folder with information. And inside our packet, we would put a report that we released, articles, like 1 or 2, not 10, but 1 or 2 articles about the attack on voting rights, the shadow report, delegate bios, and information about the organization and how to contact the organization. And it's very quick, it's nice, it's neat. You can hand it to whomever you're talking to, whether it's an NGO, whether it's a member of the committee, and they actually read it. We did this, I think, at the council. One day I was walking around and I saw the ambassador from South Africa. He had nothing in his hand except for the packet that I had given him the day before. So they actually will read them when they're presented in a very concise way. Once you leave Geneva, continue to follow and track your issue. Watch for votes and for recommendations being released. Communicate with members of the committee or governments and UN officials via phone and email, and get ready for the next session. That's very, very important. Like the work doesn't stop once you leave Geneva. Like the work really begins because there's a consultation with the U.S. government to actually implement the recommendations that are made. And this is a quasi-virtual participation. All documents on the website, orders a day on the website, audio recordings of the sessions happen, and you can watch live, and UN press releases come out every day. So you can really continue to track the issue. So I'll pause right there, and thank you so much. I do have to hop off the call early, so hopefully if there are any questions, I'll still be on the call, but if not, I'm always available via email. You can reach me at jeaddy@naacpnet.org. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joteka. We really appreciated that thorough presentation, and I think people are much more prepared now. It's so helpful to see the visuals and just to have the concrete information. And our apologies to you and to everyone else for the background noise that interrupted some parts of the presentation. We will be able to share the PowerPoints afterwards in case people and a recording of the webinar in case people want to try to listen over certain parts of it. And now we are turning over to the second portion of our webinar today, also in preparation for the trip to Geneva. And we're really honored to have with us Leonard Gorman, who is with the Navajo Nation's Human Rights Commission, and will be sharing with us some of his experiences, thoughts on rights of Indigenous peoples, and as I mentioned, talking about some of the key demands that Indigenous peoples have been making at the United Nations over the past few years. And just one other thing to mention, that the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples' Rights is actually taking place later this year in September, I believe, so he might also mention that. Leonard, if you are on the call, are you on the call? Or can you you have audio, I should say. Okay, wonderful, Leonard. So with that, I will turn over to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak and present not so much on behalf of Indigenous peoples, but I think our presentation will provide highlight of where Indigenous peoples from all over the world fit into the discussions pertaining to human rights as the world community discusses these issues. So the next slide. I just want to cover a couple of issues and just provide you some introductory comments and then some land status issues that pertain to Indigenous peoples in the United States, and then the international human rights efforts that the Navajo Nation is involved in, and then are the various international matters that we are addressing, and then how Navajo Nation is involved in the various international concerns And then finally, just conclusion. So the next slide. With regards to the introductory remarks, Navajo Nation is the only indigenous nation in the United States that has, by its statute, formulated and established a human rights entity. So in 2006, our legislature, the Navajo Nation Council, established the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission, and this happened because of some ongoing concerns in what we refer to as border towns. There are a number of communities and business outlets that provide goods and services surrounding the Navajo Nation. And there have been a number of incidents in which Navajos are targeted in many respects. So in that time frame of 2006, another incident happened in the Farmington, New Mexico community, in which caused the Navajo Nation Council to establish the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission. And we opened our doors in 2008. The first set of commissioners were instituted, and then the second set, a 5-member commission, was seated in 2012. So our mandates are to conduct public hearings, to assess race relations in the border towns. Secondly, advocate and educate Navajo citizens on human rights. And thirdly, to assist in investigation when Navajo citizens wish to file complaints with various organizations such as the EEOC, the Civil Rights Offices of the states, and then various other organs that allow for settling matters in which there are concerns about race relations, human rights issues. And finally, we're authorized to interface and network with various human rights organizations locally, nationally, statewide, and then internationally, as the U.S. Human Rights Network is such an entity. We embark upon the opportunity to engage. Came in from a meeting yesterday in meeting with a situation that occurred in Albuquerque. We met with the city folks, and then they have a human rights entity that we will be interfacing with regards to homeless people being targeted for abuse. So next slide. The next area, just a couple of slides, is just to give you a highlight of some of the activities that and policy-wise that indigenous peoples in the United States and how they have been impacted as far as the land status is concerned. Land status-wise, as we all know and read in the history books in America, how the colonizers came to what they refer to as the New World and what is now understood as North America and South America, and how the federal government, the U.S. federal government, worked against the positions and values and cultures of indigenous peoples in this continent. So predominantly there were specific legislations that were enacted by Congress. One is called the General Allotment Act, in which it was determined that indigenous families, persons need to become productive citizens and in the mainstream society, and the legislation allowed for 160 acres to be given to individual families of households and a pair of mules so that they can or agriculture, do agricultural activities so that they can become productive members of society. However, along the lines, the Navajo Nation continued to, the people itself continued to demarcate their territories, and that is we consider the 4 sacred mountains as the boundaries in which Navajo people determined it to be their territory. In the 20th century, there's continued effort to address the land status issue. There have been a number of legislative measures passed by the Congress. I think the real concern here, I think in the worldwide and domestically too, which is really misunderstood oftentimes, and that is indigenous peoples are wards of Congress. That in itself is a human rights violation. Navajo people are are resilient. They're peoples as defined under the various international laws, as those common Article 1 provisions. All peoples have the right of self-determination. Likewise, the Navajo people also have the right of self-determination. So these legislations really disturb the land relationship between the Navajo people, the land resources, territories issues, and really convoluted the relationship between Navajo people, lands, resources, and the federal government. Next slide. So when we talk about Indigenous issues, back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, the Hopi Land Act, as an example, essentially removed Navajo families from the surface removed Navajo families from the surface of where they live and restricted them to have the right to minerals issues. As a result, there were also measures instituted by the federal government to freeze land areas and to freeze them from development and freeze them from relocation activities. So those are fine examples of sheer and direct violations of Navajo people's human rights. When we deal with allocation and management of lands on the Navajo Nation does not have currently the direct authority to fully manage and direct the use of the land and the resources, surface and subsurface. All of these land management activities have to be forwarded to the U.S. government for final decision. And that's the kind of relationship we have. However, we all know in the field of human rights, all peoples have the right to own the land and the resources, surface and subsurface, and manage those territories. Navajo people don't, likewise other indigenous peoples in the United States. So we've started to evaluate the federal government's role in desecrating Navajo sacred areas. And one of those areas that we have continued to focus on is the San Francisco Peaks, one of the sacred mountains that essentially define the territories of the Navajo Nation. The continued effort by the federal government to expand facilities on the sacred mountains, regardless of the many times the Navajo peoples have said no to the expansions and the activities by the federal government. There have been efforts through the relationship, the establishment of the federal agency to address land claim issues. Aboriginal land issues have been one of the focus of the federal government. Yes, the Navajo Nation has taken advantage a number of times of those efforts by the federal government to settle some of those land claim issues. However, there's also continued effort, as an example, in the state of Utah, in the San Juan County portion, which is the southeast corner of the state. The folks in the Navajo people in that area are working with two other agencies, the county officials and the federal government's Bureau of Land Management, to ensure that whenever there is a development to occur, that the three parties are involved in any the development that occurs in that county. They all have to agree that a development does not infringe upon the sacred sites, the sacred places that are considered sacred and sacred sites and sacred places. Right. So as we get into these indigenous human rights issues, back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, earlier period, there continued to be concerns by indigenous peoples. Matter of fact, one of the indigenous nations in the eastern part of the United States was the first to visit the United Nations in Geneva, seeking the opportunity to fully in the United Nations. However, this intensified in the 60s through the 1990s, where the response from the United Nations was to establish a team of experts that would assess the rights of indigenous peoples. And in the early 1990s, this team drafted a document that was referred to at the time, the Draft Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It was a lengthy document, and it was resubmitted to the ECOSOC, and ECOSOC responded by saying that we would not refer this document for further consideration until we go through the process of reviewing the declaration. So from 1982 to until 2007, for that period of time, Navajo Nation was involved in negotiating the language paragraph by paragraph, word by word, which is now the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So in September of 2007, the General Assembly passed its resolution and adopted the declaration, but four nation states opposed the declaration when it was placed on the floor. And of course, that's the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And those nation states, as we all know, have a high population of indigenous peoples. However, since the 2007 to 2010, United States was the last nation state of the UN system to change its position on September 2007, and President Obama ordered and announced to the world community that the United States now changed its position by supporting the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Next slide. So in the discussion on the international level, the rights of indigenous peoples, there are four fundamental issues that have created a substantive debate and often have been impasse issues. Other area that I don't mention in this slide is the area of where indigenous peoples have rights, or having nation states institute effective measures to effectively make positive impacts on the daily lives of indigenous peoples. As an example, education, health, housing, things of that nature. And so in the declaration, it talks about nation states having the direct responsibility to ensure there are effective mechanisms and measures are instituted nationally, which is domestically. So going back to the points about the four areas, lands. Lands is an impasse issue. According to international studies, experts studying this issue, and the UN had instituted an expert to study this area. It's called permanent sovereignty over natural resources. The conclusion that's reached is that for the indigenous peoples to survive next millennium and fourfold of those time frames in the future, they must exercise full authority and management over lands, surface and subsurface resources. Of course, the United States has opined that no, we have conquered you, we own the land, we own the land's resources, surface and subsurface. And this is a very, very critical issue. Secondly, territories. Territories is a major concern. As I've mentioned early on, Navajo people consider the four sacred mountains as the boundaries of its territories. Four sacred mountains, all of them are situated outside the current demarcated Navajo Nation lands. However, we have the right to visit those mountains, conduct our ceremonies, and there's vast land between the demarcated Navajo land area and to the sacred mountains. And we realize that I think the intention is not to turn back time, but the society needs to recognize that indigenous peoples have rights to exercise their culture, their beliefs, and there's strong ties to these lands and places that are now considered territories of indigenous peoples. Thirdly, resources, surface and subsurface resources. Navajo people have have been involved in mining, extractive industry, where Navajo Nation has challenged activities of the federal government, in which there are efforts put forward by the federal government to essentially, without the knowledge of the Navajo Nation, negotiate terms that are not beneficial to the Navajo Nation as it pertains to extractive industries. And simply because the federal government is situated placed itself in a situation where it says that it plays a role of trust responsibility. However, on international terms, Navajo people have the right to own and manage these resources. The final area is self-determination. Self-determination, as is stated in the Common Article 1s of the Covenants, provide for all peoples having the right of self-determination. That same language in those Common Article 1 is incorporated in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and where it reads, Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And that's the same term, except only difference is in the Declaration it says Indigenous peoples. In the Common Articles it says all peoples. So this is really the cornerstone as a part of the human rights issues that the Navajo Nation has been pursuing and has been advocating for as a fundamental right of the Navajo people. Yes, because some of us are taught to believe, based on the Euro system of education, that we have never attained that right. However, we have survived as a Navajo people since time immemorial, having a common language, having a common culture, common land, and we've been exercising this right of self-determination all along. Next slide. So Navajo Nation is embarked upon specifically to utilize the sacred site, sacred place issue. So we played a significant role in protecting the Navajo people's human rights in various organs of the United Nations. One is that we have filed a complaint with the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples, and we have received a response back in 2011 from Special Rapporteur James Anaya. He's a professor of law at the University of Arizona, and in which he iterates that there are very, very strong concerns about the U.S. government's role when it expands the sacred site land area of San Francisco Peaks for a ski resort. There are standards that the United States has obligated itself to comply with, as an example, free, prior, and informed consent standard. When indigenous lands are going to be disturbed, particularly by the federal government agencies, that they must inform the people freely, well in advance of the planning stage, and that upon the consent provided by the effective indigenous people, only until then that the development will begin. Of course, the United States has opined that the indigenous peoples have veto power. That is the purpose of protecting, manifesting, and carrying on these cultures from generation to generation. The second area that we have engaged specifically is the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. We are aware that there are two organs in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere, based on the Human Rights Covenant of the Americas. There is a commission and there is a court. The United States refuses to agree to be a party to the courts, but has allowed for leeway to be a party to the commission. So Navajo Nation is working with the University of Arizona to formulate concerns and register a complaint against the United States with regards to the desecration of the San Francisco Peaks. Thirdly, we're involved in the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. As we all know, The UN system, the General Assembly in 2010, passed a resolution stating that they will conduct a world conference, which will be called World Conference on the Rights of on Indigenous Peoples, and that will take place on September 22nd and 23rd this year. Navajo Nation is pursuing particularly 4 areas of concern with a number of Indigenous nations and organizations. First one is the implementation of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It has been hard. It has been very difficult. The U.S. domestic laws are ingrained areas in which it's going to be very, very difficult for the U.S. government to recognize the fact that Navajo people own the land, not the United States government. So the implementation is number one for the Navajo Nation, to ensure that the world community, through the General Assembly, that there's further commitment to implement this declaration, through a monitoring and implementing body. Secondly, that Indigenous nations need to participate fully, meaningfully in UN systems. At the present time, Navajo Nation, like all other Indigenous nations, cannot participate in the UN activities. NGOs, organizations, have a higher status than the Navajo Nation. Yet, those NGOs and organizations are not responsible to electorate, have no responsibility to answer to a people, a flock of people such as the Navajo Nation. When Navajo delegates visit with dignitaries, they are answerable to their electorate. We have people that vote in their representatives. So we're looking at a meaningful place for Indigenous nations to participate in the UN system. Secondly, violations that are perpetrated against Indigenous women. There's been a number of studies done by the UN organs, including the Amnesty International, and it's been determined that in the United States, 80% of Indigenous women in their lifetime will be affected by violence, be perpetrated against them one way or another. So there's a high percentage of Indigenous women that are violated. So we're asking for a designation of a special rapporteur on violence against Indigenous women, and an appropriate high-level conference would be instituted. The final recommendation that we're pursuing for the World Conference is, again, going back to the sacred site issue. So we're now generating what's called a zero draft, and we'll be going to another meeting in August with the President of the General Assembly to discuss the second draft of the zero declaration draft, and which is intended to be the outcome from the World Conference. The next area is the Universal Periodic Review. Navajo Nation has hosted a number of meetings with the United States to address Indigenous human rights issues. We have very serious concerns about how the United States reports on these issues. While there is a significant attention by United States government agencies over the effective measures and means to carry on housing issues, education issues, however, there are these fundamental issues that are not appropriately addressed: lands, territories, self-determination. Those areas are not addressed by the United States. So we continue to submit shadow reports and follow through with those issues. The final one is, as we're talking about CERD, Navajo Nation filed an early warning urgent action back in 2010, I believe, and I think it's 2011 or 12, and we did not get a chance to be heard by CERD under this urgent measure, and did get a response from CERD where the United States must respond to the concerns raised by the Navajo Nation, Navajo people, and other Indigenous peoples with CERD. And the United States was given a timeline of last year to respond. They didn't respond. However, on August 13 and 14, we understand that this particular issue about sacred sites would be one of the measures to be discussed by the CERD at that time. So, having said that, next slide. We've been very active as a nation in the world community with regards to discussing Indigenous human rights issues. And as I understand these developments, it is intended to remedy violations and in hopes that the world community would live in harmony with respect and understand Indigenous human rights issues. So United Nations has had the opportunity to set aside various entities, mechanisms, such as the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples, Expert Mechanism on Indigenous Peoples, and of course the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. These are continuing activities, and Navajo Nation has been utilizing various instruments that specifically pertain to Indigenous peoples. Yes, we realize that there are plenty of treaty documents that are out there in the world that pertain to the daily lives of the Navajo people, but it has been difficult. As we all know, United States is like that little naughty kid in the classroom that doesn't want to participate, but wants to participate on its own terms. And we realize that. So we utilize the instrument, the Convention on the Elimination of all Forms of Racial Discrimination, Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the American Convention on Human Rights. The last instrument is the ILO 169, which was adopted by the International Labor Organization, which is a very good instrument, while some parts may be outdated in today's time, but that has set a lot of ground for understanding the protection of Indigenous people's rights. However, the United States refuses to ratify or even sign on to that document. So that concludes my presentation, and I really apologize to have to run off because I have another meeting to go to right now.
All right. Thank you so much, Leonard. We really, really appreciate the time you took to share with us today. And we're hoping that we can follow up with you with questions that people have after this presentation, because I understand you're needing to go to a different meeting. And for everyone listening on the call, we really hope that you will share your questions or comments with us, because this is a very important aspect of what we're hoping to do, not just in Geneva, but for our work moving forward, and making sure that we're all working in solidarity for human rights movement building, and that involves having a strong understanding of where we are all coming from. And I really appreciate the time you took, Leonard, in sharing the perspective from the Navajo Nation and also some of the common struggles of Indigenous peoples with the United States government, as well as at the United Nations. So with that, we will now turn over. We're a little bit behind on time, but we will turn over to Salima Hankins, who is our CERD coordinator, and who will be going over some of the next steps in preparation for the review in 2 weeks. Salima?
Hi, everyone. Hi, can you hear me? This
yes.
is Salima. So I'm just going to, as the agent said, kind of go over some next steps for what people need to do to prepare for Geneva for advocacy. So the first thing is that we ask that if you are going to Geneva, that you let us know, because we are going to be communicating with those heading to Geneva around logistics and other things. So we want to make sure that if you are going to Geneva, that we have your information so that we can contact you via email. And on this PowerPoint slide, you can see this is the information that we're asking for: your name, organizational affiliation, dates of stay, hotel, and whether you will be attending our orientation. And I'm actually, I just put that information on the chat window so folks can have that, and also my email address is there as well. So people can just email me if they are going to Geneva. The next thing is that if you are going to Geneva as well, you need to register with the UN to attend the CERD review. As Joteka talked about before, you need to make sure that you have a badge to get access to the buildings. So the registration deadline is today. We have here the form that you can fill out and some tips for filling it out. We received some questions from people regarding how to fill out the form. People can feel free to contact me if they have questions, but I just have some information on this PowerPoint slide, which we will be sharing with people as well. In addition to that, the actual form itself, I am sharing in the chat window, so folks can click on that as well in order to access the form. And also I've included the email address of the person that you need to send it to, Adelquist, and you want to copy the CERD committee. Even if you already have a UN ground pass, we're asking that you still register specifically for the CERD review. Next, I want to go over just briefly what our schedule is going to be generally in Geneva. So many of our delegation will be arriving on Sunday, August 10th, and the USHRN will have, the network will have a orientation at 3 o'clock at Maison des Associations. And then the next day, there will be the opening session at 10. There will be a meeting with the staff of special mandate holders. And then at 6:15, there will be a side event that Joteka mentioned, in which the coordinating center is organizing with NAACP and a host of other organizations. So we're going to be promoting that as well. On that Tuesday, there is going to be a breakfast briefing for Indigenous peoples at 8 a.m., followed by a formal meeting with civil society NGOs. Then there is an informal briefing in the morning with the CERD committee, and at 10:30 a.m. there's a meeting with the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. And then at 3 o'clock is when the actual United States review starts. And that it starts at 3 p.m. that afternoon, and then the next day at 10 a.m. it continues. By 1 p.m. there will be a small press conference. It will be very small, about 2 to 3 people selected by the coordinating center. And then we're hoping Thursday evening before people leave that we could have a get-together with all of the different groups there. And in terms of advocacy, we want to make sure that people know that even if they're not going to be in Geneva, they can still inform the advocacy that's going to happen there, and they can be involved in the advocacy at home. So the primary way to be involved with advocacy is through our working groups, and these are issue-based groups that have been meeting via phone, some of them on a regular basis, other of them periodically, to talk about how they will advocate both in Geneva and at home. Many of them met around the shadow reports that they were submitting, but now they are sort of gearing up to help inform the advocacy in Geneva. But it's really important for folks who are not, even if they're not going to Geneva, to be able to sort of inform what happens there, that they should join an issue-based working group. And other ways to be involved if you're at home is through social media. As Joteka mentioned, you can video blog, you can blog through social media, Facebook and Twitter. So there are ways for you to promote the review that's happening even at home. I have here a list of the working groups. As you can see, there are 12 working groups, and we also have on our website a list of who is on each working group. And if you're interested in joining a working group, you can just send an email to me. I'm posting right now the link on the chat where you can where you can access the working groups, and you can also look at the description, and then I have my email address as well. So that information is there. I think that's it, and I think we're going to open it up for questions right now. And Adrian, I don't know if you want to do sort of the rules for questions or...
Thank you. Thank you, Salima. So yes, we now have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So if people have any questions, you can send a question via the chat function, or you can raise your hand by scrolling over the icon that says My Mood at the top of your screen and clicking on Raise Your Hand. And then we'll call on you. Again, if people have any questions, you can send a question in via the chat, or you can raise your hand and we will call on you. Okay, so I see a few questions via the chat function. So the first question is, what role do special rapporteurs play in the CERD review itself? So the question on what the CERD review is conducted primarily by the committee members, and that's a committee of independent experts that make up the CERD, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. We do have, courtesy of the ACLU, a briefing booklet on all the committee members that we will be circulating either today or on Monday to help people in preparation to reach out to the committee members. There's no official role that the special rapporteurs play during the review itself. However, committee members rely on reports and reference reports that special rapporteurs have written on specific issues for the committee, for the review itself. So they rely on the research and the findings of the special rapporteurs for the review itself. I don't know if any of the other presenters have any additions on that, additional information on that. Okay. Well, then the next question, let's see. Okay, so the next question is, where in the U.S. review do individual interventions occur? So during the review itself, the CERD review is actually between the committee members and the U.S. government. There's no official role during the review, the interactive dialogue itself, for NGOs, for individual interventions. Our interventions as civil society come before the review takes place, through the shadow reports, through the advocacy, through the informal briefings, side events, and smaller meetings that people schedule with individual committee members themselves. As Jateka mentioned, people are encouraged to reach out to committee members, especially after you review the booklet that the ACLU put together for us, because it will help you target your advocacy. So if you're focused on a specific issue, you can look to see who is the committee member that's most interested in this specific issue, and see if you can send them information so that you're not overwhelming committee members who may it may not be their issue, or they have already decided to prioritize other issues with information, it's helpful to look at and see what they've generally demonstrated an interest in. So we have another question here. And it's a question about how committee members and the chair should be addressed during the review or during the informal briefings or in interacting with informal briefings. And I don't have a response for that. I know for the chair, he's referred to as the chair. But let's get back to you on that specific question, because I do think it's a very important question. You'll see in the UN there's a lot of protocol, and it's helpful to use some of the language that is prevalent at the UN, including the use of titles. There's a specific style, and Joteka mentioned this a little bit in her presentation, just in terms of being brief, factual, and to the point in making presentations, but also thinking about how best do I convince committee members of my point. So it really does need to be the most salient point and focusing on fact-based statements as opposed to general beliefs. So let's see. But we will respond with that with a more informed response to that specific question. Okay, so there's another question that's directed more at the coordinating center. I believe it's it's regarding an application that was sent to us. We will follow up with you offline. I think this is for Cynthia Fisher. We'll follow up with you offline because I have some additional questions on what application you're referencing, since we have a few that you could possibly be referencing. Okay, someone else is asking about the briefing booklet that the ACLU put together. We have not yet circulated it. Like I mentioned earlier, we will be circulating it either today or on Monday. But, well, it's likely that we would circulate it by the end of the day today because it's completed. Again, I think it'd be very helpful. It's based on previous statements that the committee members have made, and you also have their bios. So there's another question on whether interventions have to be written out in order for them to become UN documents. And the interventions become a part of the record if they're submitted via the shadow reporting process. So that is what becomes a part of the official record. The informal briefings that we are talking about are not part of the official record. During the formal briefing itself, the one that happens during the formal structure, in other words, on Tuesday at 10 a.m., those do not, we have not, they do not need to have, you do not need to have written documents for that intervention, but we are strongly suggesting them for two reasons. One, to help committee members follow the interventions made, but two, and equally important, to help the interpreters interpret what's being shared. We will follow up with a response as part of the question, which is whether the interventions, the oral interventions, or how the oral interventions become part of the official record of the UN, and get back to you on that question. So then there's a final question that we see here on media. And the media question is this: is there a preferred hashtag handle? I'm so excited that this question's been asked. We will be sharing that information next week. We're trying to figure out what makes the most sense in this case. Because the word CERD has, I think, an additional meaning or a different meaning in some other languages, I think primarily Spanish. So we will share a hashtag for that. And I know that Rebecca has already shared the Human Rights at Home as well as CERD. But if we have any additional hashtags, we'll share that next week. Okay, and then another question: is there a recommended structure format for the formal intervention? Those formal interventions will be happening via the working groups, and we've shared some advice on what they should look like. There's no format necessarily. The most important thing is to think about the most salient point that the group wants to get across to committee members. It's in essence one's elevator pitch. If I have 2 minutes to share information on this very important issue to me, what is the most important thing I want to share in those 2 minutes? With the understanding that I may not have another opportunity to share that information. So it's really about thinking through what the most salient information you want to share is, and to think about the fact that it should be related to CERD. In other words, this is the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So questions should be related to racial discrimination. Comments should be related to racial discrimination because that's what this committee is looking at. So making the connection, if it's not immediately obvious why something is an issue of racial discrimination, this would be the time to make that connection. All right, so I'm looking. I don't see any other questions via the chat function, and we are almost at time. With that, I will say thank you very much again to everyone who joined the call today, and in particular to our presenters, to Jateka Edie and to Leonard Gorman, and to Salima Hankins, not just for presenting, but also for helping organize this whole webinar and for all the work she's been doing to help coordinate and move us forward for the CERD review. It's been a very demanding task, and we really appreciate her handling it all and being so graceful even under fire. I'll end by thanking all of you again for joining us, and safe travels. If you're going to Geneva, we look forward to seeing you there, and otherwise we look forward to engaging with you online for the week of the review. Thank you.